Welcome to this video on the history of Stygia from the tabletop role-playing game Wraith the Oblivion. This is some first edition level stuff, but Wraith, or the concept of Wraith, predates Vampire the Masquerade in the annals of White Wolf. The project underwent a lot of troubles before it was finally published in 1994, almost as if the game itself were haunted. Now I can ramble on at tedious length about how much I love this game, but I'm going to limit myself to the broad strokes and save fun stuff like the Great War for another video. Without further ado, let's get into the history of the largest and most populous section of the underworld, Stygia, the Dark Kingdom of Iron, the Seat Eternal. In the oldest lore, known only to the most ancient of wraiths, the boundary between the worlds of the living and the dead was once much thinner. The dead could pass through the shroud and walk among the quick for a time, and legends speak of a number of heroes who descended into the underworld to perform some great feat or return an ally to the land of the living. Heracles, Aeneas, Gilgamesh, Orpheus, Odysseus, and many others. Even in those ancient days, entering the underworld was a perilous adventure. The restless dead do not suffer the living to remain in their sunless realm long. But the shroud between the two worlds hardened and became more difficult to pass. This event, the Sundering, corresponds to the birth of the first Malfeans. Malfeans are the monstrous, godlike specters who dwell beneath the underworld in the lightless nightmare realm called the Labyrinth. The goal of these creatures is to plunge all things, the underworld and then the living world, into oblivion, to reduce everything, including themselves, to absolute nothingness. There are some scholars of the dead who believe that the Sundering does not mark the birth of the numerous Malfeans known as the Neverborn, but of their suspected progenitor, the Grand Maw, the embodiment of Oblivion's will, the nexus of the hive mind shared by all specters and servants of Oblivion. The Labyrinth is equal parts haven and prison to the Malfeans, as few can dwell for any period of time away from it. Oblivion simultaneously grants them their terrifying power, but they cannot exist away from it. During the Sundering, a mysterious entity known as the Lady of Fate emerged from the chaos as the shroud hardened. She had the gift of prophecy and the ability to read the skeins of fate. She foretold of a great and fearless leader, one who would master the river of death and lead the masses of restless dead to a place of safety, until they could make the journey to the far shores, where they would be safe from Oblivion's minions. Between 1600 and 1100 BC, the dominant power of Greece was Mycenae, an Acropolis in the Peloponnese, supposedly founded by the great hero Perseus. One of the Mycenaean dead, a man named Charon, was greeted by the Lady of Fate and presented with a boat, crafted from the reeds that formed along the banks of the great river of death. The river of death in the underworld was formed from the collective beliefs of the living. The Egyptians, the Greeks, the Mesopotamians, and many other agricultural peoples who depended on rivers for their prosperity in life believed that rivers were equally important in death. Charon traveled the river Styx alone for years, learning every stream, inlet, and cove of the massive and turbulent river that seemed to stretch on forever. Finally, he reached the delta of the river, then dumped into the sunless sea. Formed from the corpus, or the spirit substance, of thousands of stranded spirits who had given up their consciousness, was an island at the mouth of the river, the Isle of Sorrows. And standing on the isle's brutal shores, waiting to lead Charon from his long journey, was none other than the Lady of Fate. The lady congratulated Charon, and told him that he would be the first of many to make the journey through the Shadowlands, those who were dead, but still fettered to the world of the living, just as he was. She bid him guide the dead to the Isle of Sorrows, and take a tithe from the dead for his service, help them find transcendence, and give them safe passage from the Isle of Sorrows to the far shores, where the restless dead could at last find eternal rest. As the Lady of Fate prophesied, the restless dead came to Charon. He led them safely along the river of death's treacherous pathways to the Isle of Sorrows, and taught them to make boats like his own. Some of the dead souls were so light that they could drift across the sunless sea to the far shores without any assistance. Others preferred to watch over their loved ones still in the world of the living, and did not make the journey down the river. A few swore to assist Charon in his task of shepherding the restless dead along the river across to the sunless sea. These became the Order of the Oar, the Society of the Boatmen, the mythical psychopomps equipped with hooded robes, lanterns, and scythes, the Ferrymen. After the founding of the Ferrymen, a storm rose from the labyrinth to assail the underworld, a storm made up of ghosts who had become shadow-eaten servants of oblivion, specters. The ferrymen fought against this host and continued their duty to usher the dead to safety. When the waters calmed, several ferrymen journeyed across the sunless sea to find safer routes to the far shores. These ferrymen were thereafter known as the Shining Ones. The Lady of Fate returned to Charon following the Shining One's departure. She urged him to descend into the labyrinth and confront the forces of annihilation in their own lair. Charon, armed with his lantern and scythe, descended the veinous stair, the pulsating marble path that led down into the labyrinth. No one is certain how long Charon remained in that realm of utter darkness, shaped by the alien minds and wills of the Malfians. The ferrymen continued in their sworn task. They patrolled the river of death and the sunless sea with a tireless vigilance, wondering at Charon's fate. A few brave wraiths who approached the veinous stair swore they heard sounds of a great battle in the lightless chasm below, but none dared descend themselves. Finally, Charon re-emerged from the labyrinth, but he did not do so alone. At his side was another wraith, a wraithsmith named Nudri, who bore the art of shaping plasm, the material of souls, into useful items. Upon Charon's return from the labyrinth, he summoned the ferrymen to the Isle of Sorrows to debrief them on what had transpired. He found a host of souls in the labyrinth, specters lost to oblivion who had gone untended by the ferrymen. Charon rebuked the ferrymen for their laxity, and they swore to redouble their efforts towards shepherding the newly dead to their proper places in the underworld. As this meeting broke up, other ferrymen arrived on the Isle of Sorrows. The Shining Ones, who had departed long ago, returned. They had discovered the far shores, islands of safety where the righteous dead feasted and suffering was unknown. These wraiths had found inner peace, resolved their fetters, and could transcend any time they wished. Charon thoroughly questioned the Shining Ones about the far shores. He copied their maps of the sunless sea and set out himself for the far shores. Once again, the ferrymen were left to their task, bound only by their oaths and their honor to fight oblivion and guide the dead. Charon returned to the Isle of Sorrows near the end of the 6th century BC, after the founding of the Roman Republic. Bearing 7 great signs from the Shining Ones who remained on the far shores, Charon claimed that by these signs he had gained sole power and authority to judge the dead who emerged in the Shadowlands. Setting the 7 signs into a great iron tablet forged by Nudri, he established the Isle of Sorrows as the seat from which he would render his judgments, the seat eternal, and the cornerstone of his new city, Stygia, the city of the dead, at the mouth of the river Styx. Charon scoured the underworld for the ruined, plasmid echoes of the great cities of antiquity, Babylon, Ilium, Athens, Sparta, Sodom, Gomorrah, and others. Still a Mycenaean at heart, Charon fashioned his new city in a classically Greek way with bits of Rome, wide avenues, open squares, pillared halls, and grand monuments to those ferrymen who had been destroyed in Charon's service. At the center of Stygia, Charon constructed a mammoth lighthouse, whose light could be seen from leagues away on the sunless sea. At the top of the lighthouse, he hung the lantern he had carried with him into the labyrinth, and had served him in that fell place. Stygia was to be a beacon to all of the restless dead, a place of safety and peace for those lost in the storms of the Deadlands. To administer his new republic, Charon appointed 7 of his most trusted lieutenants to serve as senators, each with the duty to oversee the souls of the dead, based on the nature of their demise, whether by violence, by accident, by disease, by starvation, by suicide, by age, or by madness. Charon would preside over this Senate of the Dead as consul, and first among equals. The Senate's first act was to construct temples on the shore of Stygia, in order to sort the newly arrived according to their beliefs in life, the things they had left unresolved, and the far shore best suited to their beliefs and needs. Stygia was neither the first nor the only realm of the dead. Before Charon even established Stygia, some ferrymen managed to reach the ancient realm of Neter-Kertit, the underworld of the Egyptian dead, ruled by the undying king, Osiris. The ferrymen struck a bargain with Anubis, the protector of Amenti, and supposedly the first man to ever die. In exchange for certain knowledge the ancient Anubis possessed, such as the art of arkanoi and tutelage on the anatomy of the soul, the ferrymen agreed to certain, let's say, services, to be rendered at some point in the future. Charon agreed to the necessity of the bargain. In addition to Neter-Kertit, Stygia received emissaries from the Ivory Queen, alleged ruler of the African underworld, as well as Yu Huang, emperor of the Dark Kingdom of Jade, the underworld of Asia. One of the benefits bestowed on Charon by the Lady of Fate's mandate and reinforced by his possession of the Seven Signs was the right of the ferryman to claim a tithe for passage down the river of death in the form of 2 obol, coins placed on the eyes, under the tongue, or in the hands of the dead. The coins crossed over with the wraith spirit as grave goods and manifested in the underworld along with the newly dead. Those who were too impoverished or impious to make the appropriate contribution could still reach Stygia, but their payment would be taken in another way. Those without the requisite obol paid for their passage by having their hands cleaved off or their eyes plucked out. Charon handed over these tithes to Nudri, who used his arts to forge Charon's official regalia, his blade and symbol of office, Siklos, his second lantern, Lumen, and the masks of the senators and the consul. Nudri forged 7 masks for each of the senators, then took a piece from each mask to forge one for Charon, for he was part of them, and they were part of him. Nudri and Charon, inspired by the works of the Romans in the Skinlands, constructed a network of roads throughout the Shadowlands, and all roads led through the Tempest to Stygia. Nudri followed the paths of the Roman legions as they marched, laying down fresh roads in the Shadowlands of Gaul, Britannia, Iberia, Africa, Syria, and Judea. As Roman legionaries fell in battle, the ferrymen guided these soldiers to Stygia, where they continued their profession from life, and formed legions of the dead to make war against the specters. Charon also decreed the Lux Veritatis, the light of truth. To combat oblivion, Charon commanded that all of the best of humanity, the artistic, the literary, or scientific, be collected and delivered to the archival vaults built beneath Stygia, where they could be preserved for all time. These 2 acts, the collection of the tithe and the Lux Veritatis, caused a breach between Charon and the ferrymen that was never repaired. Many ferrymen regarded the Lux Veritatis as an act of vanity and a waste of resources that could have been better spent on locating and safely ushering wraiths to the far shores. As for the tithe, they protested against Charon's policy of maiming the dead in the name of building his city. The ferrymen tried to help these unfortunate wraiths where they could, but many disappeared after their disfigurement. Most of these maimed wraiths fell to oblivion and disappeared forever, but many more crawled, blinded or crippled, to the mouth of the Venus Stair. Guided by their shadows, these victims of Charon's ambition pleaded with the eternal darkness to give them justice, and offered oblivion the only thing they had left to them, their souls. Rome delivered many new dead to the underworld, and no small number of these had died in defiance of Rome's laws and power. These outlaws, these renegades, some of them revolutionaries, and some innocent, saw the legionaries who had preceded them in death in Charon's service, and transferred their acrimony for Rome to the leader of Stygia. The renegades banded together and preyed on unwary caravans of wraiths and ferrymen. Charon responded by raising a force of equitae, or cavalry, to patrol the highways of the Shadowlands and mete out justice to the renegades. These equitae would become colloquially known among wraiths as the Death Knights. In 476 AD, everything came to a head. The fall of Rome saw hordes of the dead enter the Shadowlands in previously unheard of numbers, too much for the ferrymen to handle. Then, a great howl emitted from the Venus Stair and the labyrinth below. Charon knew what manner of creature made such a sound. Alarms rang out across Stygia as ferrymen and death knights rushed to arms. Specters exploded out of the labyrinth like a deluge, spreading destruction and terror across the city. And at the head of this force of destruction were specters, twisted and misshapen, glutted on the power of oblivion, but missing their hands, or whose empty eye sockets glowed with pure, fiery hatred. Charon himself descended from the Onyx Tower to do battle against the forces of oblivion, as he had before Stygia's creation. No one knows how long the fight lasted, but in the end, Charon's forces managed to snatch victory from the void. But Stygia lay in ruins, its temples, manses, and monuments reduced to rubble, its roads and byways smashed, and its people huddled together in the uppermost rooms of the few places still standing, their souls racked with fear. The time of the Stygian Republic had come to an end. With Charon's trusted senators dead, and the destruction of the first great Maelstrom fresh in his mind, Charon set about rebuilding Stygia into a bastion that could withstand further assaults from oblivion. Again, taking his lessons from the living, Charon would declare himself emperor. This was the final straw for most of the ferrymen who were willing to follow Charon when he had been first among equals, but would not bend their knees to an immortal tyrant. The majority of the ferrymen abandoned Charon or flung themselves into the well of the void as a final act of defiance. Charon decreed that the ferrymen were forever banished from Stygia and commanded that they be subject to the damnatio ad memoriae. All records of their names were struck from Stygia's records. All memorials to them that survived the first great Maelstrom were pulled down. Any temples they used were torn down brick by brick and used to rebuild other structures. The new Emperor of the Dead then raised up new senators, who would also serve as his legates, and bestowed upon them each the title of Death Lord. Each of the Death Lords maintained authority over an aspect of death, and were further empowered to militarize those who fell under their purview. Between the Equites, the Death Knights, and the Death Lords and their legions, Stygia was secure for rebuilding. Decades later, Stygia was rebuilt, but the underworld was changed. Renegades stalked the Shadowlands and the River of Death. As the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth spread in the mortal world, displacing the old pagan religions, the power of the ancient far shores diminished, along with the power of the shining ones who dwelled in those places. In honor of those who had fought for Stygia, Charon created the Imperial Order of the Sickle, and admitted those Equites, as well as the few ferrymen who remained loyal to him, into that martial brotherhood. The Order of the Sickle patrolled the Shadowlands to check renegade wraiths who hid there. The Grand Artificer, Nurdri, and his apprentices worked around the clock for centuries at their forges to rebuild and reinforce Stygia, as well as repair the roads that connected the new dark empire of iron. As Stygia recovered from the first great Maelstrom, it received a new visitor. Floating into the harbor on a great golden ship came wraiths from a previously unknown far shore named Paradise. During the reconstruction of Stygia, these wraiths of Paradise, who called themselves Fishers, built a temple of their own on one of the hills of the Isle of Sorrows, where they loaded their vessel with hopeful wraiths, so many that it seemed that the ethereal boat might sink. Eventually, the Fishers presented themselves to the Emperor Charon, who demanded, not asked, demanded, that the Emperor tithe to their temple. Charon refused, saying that he served the Lady of Fate and the dead as a whole, not the far shores, and certainly not this so-called Paradise, which was unknown to him. After a period of tense negotiation between the Fishers and Charon, the two sides signed the Treaty of Paradise. The Fishers would turn over any and all relics and artifacts they collected to Stygia. Stygia would, in return, freely give over all wraiths who sought paradise to the Fishers, without question. This bargain relieved some of the mounting pressure on Stygia from the wraiths arriving on its shores with no ferrymen to convey them to the far shores. Charon made additional modifications to the structure of Stygia as feudalism came into fashion in the mortal world. The hierarchy was established, with Charon at its pinnacle, the Death Lords beneath him, the Death Knights and legions beneath the Death Lords. Below them were the free wraiths, who had sufficient mastery of their shadows to be trusted to act independently of the legions. And at the very bottom of society were the thralls. serf wraiths bound in unbreakable chains of Stygian steel and usable as labor or payment. In addition to the legions, Charon approved of the creation of the guilds, groups of free wraiths united by their use of certain arcanoi, the mystical arts of the dead. The free wraiths of the guild would be responsible for the training, fellowship, and if need be, disciplining of those who practiced the particular art of that guild. The Crusades provided a fresh crop of warriors, Christian and Muslim, to join the legions of the dead. For the Crusaders and Jihadis who were expecting heaven only to see their hated enemy in the Shadowlands, death was a jarring experience. Many times they tried to keep right on fighting each other. Once the Equites and legions sorted them out, the dead warriors soon fell in line. The process went even quicker for those who survived an attack by marauding specters. In 1347 AD, the Black Plague swept throughout Europe, reaping its terrible harvest of death that glutted the ranks of the Skeletal Legion, those who died from disease. This time, the forces of Oblivion found Stygia ready to receive them. Nudri's great seawall held the specters at bay, while ordered, disciplined ranks of legionaries and death knights cut through the specters with ruthless efficiency. After the threat passed, Charon, overwhelmed by the new dead arriving in Stygia, commanded a census of the newcomers, as well as of any relics in their possession. Those relics were taxed from their owners in the name of keeping the empire functioning. The Fishers had grown in numbers and power over the centuries since their first arrival, to the point that they were the largest faction in Stygia, with their own force of Crusader knights and death bishops. This was thanks to some minor puffery in their sales pitch. Not only did the Fishers portray their particular far shore as the only afterlife for Christian wraiths, there were in fact 19 such afterlives registered with the hierarchy, they deceived the hierarchy as to the number of souls they transported to paradise, and in some cases transported said souls by force. The Fishers grew bold enough to approach Charon once again, and demand that he lower the tithe they owed as part of the Treaty of Paradise. But Charon not only refused to be swayed, but doubled the amount and ordered the disbanding of the Crusader Knights. For months after, the Crusader Knights patrolled the outside of the Fisher Temple in blatant defiance of Charon's command. Then, one day, the Crusader Knights made their move. A column of their troops marched on the Onyx Tower, intent on launching a revolt against Charon and the Death Lords, but they were betrayed by one of their own to the Death Knights. The Equites were lying in wait for the Crusaders. Those who weren't sent to Oblivion were chained from the lighthouse and burned for days as barrel fires slowly devoured their corpus. When the obvious traitors were dealt with, Charon and his Equite marched on the Fisher Temple. They discovered inside a trove of relics and other treasures withheld from the Emperor in violation of the treaty. Charon was outraged. He dispatched messengers to the far shores and issued a command that all of the Shining Ones, including the Fishers, were to leave Stygia on the next tide or suffer his wrath. The great evacuation to the far shores was chaotic, as ships of all sizes and constructions were jammed full to bursting with the dead evacuees. As the evacuation was carried out, Charon's messengers returned to him with dire news. The Shining Ones, and by extension the far shores, had forsaken their duties. No longer were they places of respite and healing for souls, but they had become places of terrible brutality and neglect. Many souls languished on the far shores, caged, and eventually became shadow-eaten. Charon despaired on hearing this, and retired to his chambers in the Onyx Tower. For weeks he spoke to no one, not his Equites, not the Death Lords, no one. Rumors swirled that the Emperor of Stygia had become so despondent that he fell to oblivion and was no more. Then one day, Charon appeared on his balcony. His voice rang out across the city, issuing a proclamation of reason. He charged the Shining Ones with treachery against Stygia and the souls that it had given into their care. He declared transcendence to be a lie, denounced the Shining Ones as heretics, and commanded that they be hunted down to the last wraith. Charon empowered a new office to enforce the proclamation of reason, the Magisterium Veritatis, and its martial branch, the Order of the Unlidded Eye. The legions and free wraiths of Stygia came to call them the Inquisition, as they ruthlessly hunted down heretics and those who gave aid to the heretics or even sympathized with the heretics, binding them over to the soul forges to be reshaped into Stygian steel. As the river of death crowded with renegades, as heretics whispered their blasphemous doctrines in secret, and as neighbor turned upon neighbor in fear of Charon's Inquisition, Stygia became a city under siege, from enemies without and within. In this miasma of dread and suspicion, 3 abominations came to pass. The first abomination took place in the early 16th century, when a significant force of renegades attacked Stygia. Charon and the Death Knights drove this rabble from the city, but not before some of them managed to reach the Onyx Tower and managed to steal a number of relics and artifacts from its vaults, including the Lance of Longinus. The second abomination was the breaking of the guilds. Following the attack of the renegades, the guild masters, and the Artificer Guild in particular, believed that Charon and the Death Lords were too weak to defend Stygia and conspired to usurp the hierarchy. On April 6, 1598, the guilds declared their revolt against Charon. But when their rebellion was met with greater strength from the Death Lords than they had anticipated, the Usurers Guild and the Maskers Guild quickly abandoned the cause, and the entire effort collapsed. Among the leaders consigned to the Soul Forges for their treason were Nudri's 3 original apprentices, who had helped their master build the roads and buildings of Stygia in its earliest days. On April 14th, Charon issued the Decree of Breaking, prescribing and outlawing the Free Wraiths guilds, and condemned any who claimed membership to thraldom, branding, or worse punishment. The guilds would continue, though it would be in secret, either by infiltrating the legions or acting as renegades. The third abomination is known as the Flaying. Heretics and renegades, attempting to flee from Stygia's authority, rode on the ships of the European explorers to the Americas, where they discovered a previously unknown dark kingdom of wraiths. These Mesoamerican wraiths called their corner of the underworld the Flayed Lands. The Stygian wraiths named this place the Dark Kingdom of Obsidian. The heretics and renegades, fearful of Charon's Inquisition behind them, and also fearful of the power of the Flayed Land wraiths fueled by human sacrifice, compelled the Spanish conquistadors and other things that had arrived with them to attack the populations they drew their power from. The leader of the Obsidian Wraiths, Ixchel, and all of his people were wiped out by the Flaying, cast into a massive pit by the heretics and renegades, and then buried by their conquerors. These abominations compounded one upon the other until the third great Maelstrom rose up from the labyrinth. This time, the Maelstrom was not a mindless storm horde of specters. It was an army, led by a Nephrak, a subspecies of specter that is immediately subordinate to the Malfeans, and only marginally inferior in power to those terrible creatures. This Nephrak's name would strike fear in wraiths for centuries to come: the General Coldheart. Coldheart managed to make the River of Death so dangerous that even the ferrymen would not travel it, instead making use of Charon's byways. The specters laid siege to Stygia itself, this time with proper tactics. Once again, the forces of Oblivion were turned back, but the siege had been hard, and the walls of Stygia were near to bursting with the dead. As the far shores were closed, the River of Death was made perilous, and heretics, renegades, and specters stalked the Shadowlands. Charon determined that yet another reorganization was needed. He decreed that the free wraiths of Stygia were permitted, nay, encouraged, to carry arms, swords of Stygian steel, both to defend the city as it might be called for, and as a symbol of their personal loyalty to the emperor. The other was to widen the practice of thraldom. Those wraiths with weak ties and sense of self were swept up, chained, and put to hard labor, mining the veinous stair for the ore needed to make Stygian steel, as well as other labors needed to expand and maintain Stygia's expanding economy in souls and goods. And when these thralls were of no more use, when their psyches were almost exhausted by their mindless, harsh, and repetitive tasks, they were consigned to the soul forges to be burned, melted, hammered, worked into the ore they had dug out of the labyrinth, and finally shaped into useful and eternal objects. To further relieve the pressure of the Wraith population on Stygia, Charon commanded the creation of colonies in the Shadowlands. The first of these was the Necropolis of London, England, a fortress in the shadow of that great city against renegades and maelstroms. This necropolis was given over to the legions, who defended the interconnected structure against renegade attacks. Soon the hierarchy constructed more necropoli in Rome, Paris, New Amsterdam, Boston, and Philadelphia. The necropoli and the legionary stationed there signaled to the heretics and renegades that they would no longer have free run of the Shadowlands. As science and technology marched in the mortal world, more wraiths emerged in the Shadowlands with the ability to construct the machines of industry. Charon's ancient roads eventually became railways. Wooden boats gave way to Stygian steel-hulled vessels. Soul forges were replaced with factories and foundries. This called for yet more thralls, more labor, more material to feed the machine of industry that was growing in the realm of the dead. As for the rulers of Stygia, Charon, and the Death Lords, and the upper echelons of the hierarchy, they found that they had been turned into domen by the 19th century. A domen is a wraith whose fetters in the mortal world are destroyed before the wraith can resolve them, thereby trapping that wraith in the tempest. Of course, the Death Lords immediately accused one another of conspiring against the rest. Charon retired to the Onyx Tower, and without his oversight, the legions and Death Lords squabbled amongst themselves, unaware that another storm was rapidly approaching. On August 1st, 1914, the first shot of World War I was fired. Entire platoons and companies crossed the shroud at once, their corpora disfigured by bullets, bayonets, shrapnel, gas, and the myriad horrors of total and industrialized war. Some even brought their weapons across with them. Many wraiths, for the first time, learned what machine gun fire sounded like. This time, the specters invaded from the Shadowlands, attacking not at the height of the Great War, but as mortals were exhausted from war and negotiating for peace. The wraiths of the hierarchy took shelter in the citadels of the Necropoli against the screaming storm of specters. The fourth great Maelstrom eventually reached Stygia, battering and breaking against the storm walls of the city and its newly constructed iron towers and walkways. Some learned wraiths now believe that the fourth great Maelstrom was a massive feint by the forces of Oblivion, a distraction for their true goal. Specters crossed the shroud and skin-rolled mortals, setting off unprecedented waves of crime and murder in the aftermath of the Great War. They had learned to delight in human suffering and feed from it. When Charon emerged from the Onyx Tower, he learned of the chaos in the Necropoli and the damage done by the fourth great Maelstrom. He issued a standing bounty on all specters who could be found and destroyed, and accepted proof of such destruction in the form of their ears or teeth or other such parts of their corpus. This was the beginning of the paramilitary organization of wraiths known as the Doomslayers, bounty hunters and vigilantes whose prey was specters. The true big-game hunters of the Doomslayers would descend into the labyrinth itself in pursuit of their quarry. The Second World War exceeded the first in scale and kind. Once again, thousands of soldiers entered the Shadowlands at a time, their minds muddled in the confusion of their deaths, often with their enemies crossing the shroud soon before or after them. Others crossed the shroud as well, in the thousands, and then millions. These were not the war dead. They entered the Shadowlands naked, screaming, numbered, and slaughtered with the impersonal butchery one might find in an avatar. The underworld had its own war as well. Charon commanded the legions to carry out an expedition against the Jade Emperor, Yu Huang of the Yellow Springs. The iron warships of Stygia cut through the Sea of Storms and met Jade warships of the Yellow Springs in open battle, as the two sides fought to lay claim to the souls of the war dead who perished in the Pacific Theater. It was there that the fifth great Maelstrom began, the most devastating that any wraith had yet seen. The two atomic bombs that exploded over Hiroshima and Nagasaki sent a shockwave across the Shadowlands and tore open a rift to the labyrinth. A wave of black fire consumed and dragged any wraith caught in its path down into the void. thousands of lesser maelstroms erupted across the Shadowlands, battering the Necropoli and forcing unprotected wraiths into destruction harrowings as their shadows tried to plunge them into oblivion right on the spot. Travel through the Tempest became nearly impossible, whether by road, by river, or by rail. Every citadel was cut off from the storm and forced to fight for their own survival without hope of reinforcement from the outside. It was a fight that many lost and were never seen or heard from again. The climax of the fifth great Maelstrom was the emergence of a Malfeyan from the Tempest. Awakened by the death storm of the atomic blasts and loosed from the labyrinth was a titanic beast named Gurul. The Malfeyan Gurul marched across the sunless sea towards Stygia. The ships sent out to stop the creature were torn to pieces by its rows of teeth, claws, or stinging tail, and the crews either devoured or lost to the Tempest. Charon looked out from the Onyx Tower as Gurul came within sight of his city, and knew that Stygia's final hour was at hand. The Death Lords shut themselves up in their chambers. They would not meet Gurul in battle, nor would they risk leaving Stygia and allow one of their rivals to take advantage of their absence. Charon removed his mask of office finally, and left it in his chambers. He picked up his blade, Siklos, and his reed boat, the same boat that was given to him by the Lady of Fate millennia ago. The Emperor of the Dead, no, the first ferryman, set out, alone into the Weeping Bay, to face the creature that had come to destroy his city. Gurul sensed the power of Charon's soul and approached him, turning away from Stygia. Wraith and Spectre clashed, as the heat and dark of the Maelstrom screamed around them. Using Arcanoi known only to him, Charon opened a mighty whirlpool in the Weeping Bay. Still aboard his boat, Charon plunged downward, swiftly followed by Gurul. As the whirlpool closed, and the tempest calmed, neither the Wraith nor the Malfeyan reappeared. And so ended the fifth great Maelstrom. Stygia was saved, at the cost of its founder and greatest leader, Charon. The Dark Kingdom of Iron would endure without its emperor, for a time. After all, wraiths are creatures of fate and passion. So long as the two continue to meet and intertwine, there will always be another ghost story to tell. This has been an overview of the history of the Wraiths of Stygia. Before I wrap up, I want to say, once again, I love Wraith. Vampire is a great setting. It's angsty, but its angst can, at times, be shallow in places. Wraith is some heavy stuff. In Wraith, you are dropped into the underworld, which, if it isn't hell, it's definitely a close runner-up. You are at risk as a Wraith of being press-ganged by the legions, recruited into a heretic, cult, or a renegade gang, bushwhacked by specters, or just flat-out enslaved by the hierarchy and possibly even soul-forged into Stygian steel. Imagine spending eternity as a paving stone. Now imagine being conscious for the duration. Worst of all, your most fearsome enemy, your shadow, is living inside of your own head. It knows all of your secrets, which buttons to press to make you jump or scream, and can telepathically trade notes with its friends to help drive you into oblivion. But once you drill down past all of that darkness and doom and despair, Wraith is a game about courage. Having the courage to journey into the unknown and the undiscovered, to march alone into the darkest reaches with only a single light to guide you, to step into the raging storm and stand your ground, to face down the monsters that have laid waste to all who came before you, and finally, to have the courage to look inward, to confront everything about yourself that you dislike, your fears, your grudges, your failures, your unrealized ambitions, and your unfinished business. And if a Wraith can manage that mightiest of tasks, then their shadow goes quiet, transcendence is theirs, and the soul continues on its eternal journey to whatever land exists beyond mere life and death. Alright, enough smooching and gushing about Wraith. What's left? Vampire? Werewolf? Hunter? Demon? Orpheus? Decisions. Until next time.